And welcome, everybody. Hands-on Apologetics. You have entered into Virgin Most Powerful Apologetics Dojo. And welcome back, everybody. Hands-on Apologetics. Well, like I said, not always lead to God. Sometimes there are proofs for the existence of God that ultimately end up denying certain attributes that ought to be affirmed. And there's also some pushback as to the classical theistic approach to the existence of God. And to help us sort all that out, we have our good friend John DeRosa with us. John has an undergraduate degree in math education at the College of New Jersey and an MA in pure and applied mathematics at Montclair State University. He is the purveyor of an incredible podcast ministry called ClassicalTheism.com. If you haven't checked it out, please do, because he's got the best of the best in philosophy and just fantastic information on there, specifically looking at the God of theism, classical theism in conversation. Also, I have to tout this because I highly recommend it. If you're a serious apologist and you don't have this book, shame on you. Go buy it immediately. It is this book. It's called One More God Than You, How to Answer Atheistic Slogans and Challenges. It's a fantastic book. Pick it up. And here he is, the one, the only John DeRosa. Hey, John, how you doing?
Gary Machuda, it is great to be back. Thank you so much again for the kind words and for promoting the book, which I love to remind listeners, it's because of you that book exists. You really introduced me to Catholic Answers and encouraged me to continue that project. So thanks for that.
Yeah, but hey, that's only because you were giving this stuff away free on your website, classicaltheism.com. And that one free book you gave me, I said, this is crazy, John. This needs to be in print so more people can get a hold of it and, have a copy on hand in case they, need a quick reference or something. So thank you for following up on that. I'm glad that it came to print.
No, me too. And I'm working with Catholic Answers. We'll see if we can get a second printing. I'm trying to add an extra appendix and maybe even a few other things, but we'll talk about that on the podcast when it's time. But yeah, if you're interested in, you get these atheist slogans out there. There's some popular ones. There's some serious ones. How do you respond, when someone brings up the problem of evil, when someone says Christianity contradicts science, when someone says, how can I believe in God when there's not enough evidence for his existence? Or if you were born in Saudi Arabia, you would have just been a Muslim. It's just arbitrary why you're a Christian. There's so many of these slogans that get thrown around. If you want to know how to answer 20 of them with some questions and some important principles and examples, that's what I walk you through in that book. So, yeah, I hope people benefit from it, and I look forward to adding more to that list of slogans in the future.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, great. Well, that's good news. Well, John, I tried to set this up at the beginning of the program that there is more than one way to argue for the existence of God, and the two competing ways is classical theism, and another one's called theistic personalism, usually it's called. And the problem with theistic personalism is it denies certain attributes about God. So maybe you can we'll begin by defining, what should Catholics know when talking about the classical theist?
Yeah, absolutely. No, and I host the Classical Theism podcast, so I'm happy to talk about classical theism. And then I thought it would be also good, which we haven't really done on the show yet, but to go into Scripture and some examples of, can the classical theism position really make sense of Scripture and all that it says about God? Because as you get into these debates with different views of God, that's one of the objections you're going to hear, that Catholics, you're just into all that extra Greek philosophy picked up by St. Thomas Aquinas, and you don't really hold to Scripture as your primary authority. That's why you have all this extra weird stuff about God. And I think we could show that, no, that's not right, that the classical theism position is grounded in Scripture as well as tradition and the magisterium and good philosophy. So I definitely think we should get to that. But before that, I want to put the horse ahead of the cart. Cart ahead of the horse. The horse is supposed to be ahead of the cart.
That's right. Yeah.
Right. So I don't want to put the cart in front of the horse. So what do we mean? It's always good when we're talking about classical theism to define that as opposed to these other conceptions. And I would just say briefly, classical theism refers to the traditional conception of God where he is conceived of as the ultimate metaphysical reality the creator of everything else that exists and who sustains it in existence for as long as it exists. And he is perfect in himself, yet he creates creatures who participate in him. And this foundational view where he's considered like the most ultimate thing, the creator of everything else, the buck stops with God, it can be found in not just, Jewish, Christian, and Muslim thinkers, like we could list out respectively, like Moses Maimonides. Christians would be Athanasius, Augustine Aquinas. In the Muslim tradition, it would be people like Avicenna and Averroes, not only in those religious traditions, but even in Greek thinkers such as, Plato, who had an idea of the good. You could talk about Aristotle, who had an idea of the unmoved mover. And you could talk about the Plotinus, who had his idea of the one simple reality. All of these folks, whether in the religious or non-religious traditions, are getting at the fact that there is an ultimate reality. There's an uncaused cause. There's something with which the buck of explanation must stop. And we can talk about contingency arguments and cosmological arguments and existential arguments like Dr. Edward Fazer defends and so on. But when you run these arguments, you will find inevitably that everything can be walked back to a single reality that is unlike the others. And this ultimate reality is what we in the Catholic tradition have called God. And this God of classical theism, not only are we going to say he's, powerful, all-knowing, and perfectly good, but we hold to, as you were alluding to, Gary, earlier, we really hold to the whole batch of attributes that's found in patristic and medieval writers, including divine simplicity, divine immutability, divine impassibility, divine eternity. And we've done previous shows on that, and listeners who come over to my podcast will hear us defend all of those attributes. But we're going to hold that God is really, we're going to hold to that robust conception of God, and I'm going to defend this from the Catholic perspective in a moment. But I just want to say, I would put classical theism up there. And then you mentioned theistic personalism. I am a little bit more sensitive these days to using that because some people are taking it as a pejorative. I don't think Father Brian Davis, when he coined the term, meant it as a pejorative term at all. I think he just wanted to point out that there's some people who start thinking about God as an ultimate reality, and there's others who kind of conceive of God as like an ultimate person, sort of like we are, but with all these souped up attributes. And they start thinking about him like that way, and then they strip away the finite limitations and augment him and kind of mold him in a way that he is more comparable to creatures than the God of classical theism would be. God of classical theism, we're going to say he's radically different. Now, so if people are taking that as a pejorative, theistic personalism, I'm happy to call it something different. So I would say there's classical theism, and then there's anyone who wants to modify it. We could call it modified classical theism or neoclassical theism or different aspects. There's people who did, this, Gary, going back in the 20th century, probably mid-20th century, there was process theism, when they argued that God could undergo processes and grow and change over time. So there's all these different kinds of labels, but we're going to have classical theism at the top. We'll have all these kinds of versions that want to modify it. And then even below that, I've come to distinguish these three levels in my most recent thinking, because I would really put it below that is what I call finite theism. And that's really what a lot of the new atheists had in mind, where they conceived of God like a Zeus or an Odin or just another super creature flying up around in the crowds. And no one's really held to that. And when you think of God along those lines, you really are misconceiving of him and knocking down a straw man, because that's not what any serious religious tradition typically thinks of, at least if you're talking about Jews, Christians, and Muslims when they talk about God. So I would distinguish those three levels, and I would say we as Catholics would hold to classical theism. And I'm going to back that up in a moment with some quotes from the Catechism, but I'll just kind of start there with the definitions, and then we can get into some details and some scripture.
Yeah, very good. And I like your description, because I think the neo-classical theism, you can see why it would be attractive for Protestants, especially Bible-based Protestants, because it's a lot easier to take what you see in Scripture and kind of project it up to God and just make them the most maximal strong, the most maximally intelligent. And then when they look at classical proofs, they're like, well, he seems kind of distant and cold, and it just doesn't seem to fit the Scriptures.